Okay, welcome to lesson 30. Let's continue with nested lists. So let's have a nested list here. X equals 1, 2, 10, 20, 30, 40, and 5, 6, and 7. So they shouldn't have the same number of elements, or the number of elements in each sublist shouldn't be the same. So you know how to access an element from a nested list. So what about changing an element in a nested list? So you simply write the name of the list and then the location of the element that you want to change or update its element, its value. So x ij equals the new value. So let's say I want to change the value of 5. I want to have 15. So x and 2 pairs of square brackets. So the first index I refers to the sublist. So the first sublist with index 0, index 1, and index 2. Here we have 2. Now it's about 5. Now we have to go inside the sublist. So here we have 0, 1, 2. So the blue ones are indexes for this sublist. So the index of 5 is 0. So I said I wanted to change the value to 15 equals 15. So we assign 15 to this element here. So 5 becomes 15. So this is the way to update the value of an element in a nested list. So I told you that each sublist is also a list. So it means you can apply the built-in functions like min, max, sum, and some other built-in functions. So let's say here we have max. So you want to find the maximum element in the second sublist, 10, 20, 30, 40. First, you have to access the sublist, the name of the list, the main list, and then so we need the whole sublist, right? So what is the index? 1. So this is a list. So this is not an element, this is just a list. But if you have something like this, it means you have an element, not a sublist. But here we have a sublist or a list. So x square brackets 1. So what is the maximum element here? So it's obvious we have 40. So like this max function, you can apply min, sum, and other built-in functions. So how to iterate through a nested list? So x equals, let's have some elements, 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 0, 1, and here 20, 30. You can use both while loop and for loop. So it's really common to use for loop whenever you want to iterate through a sequence, a list, string, a tuple. So let's use a for loop for I in range. So I want to iterate through list X. So I want to start from the beginning to the end. Len of X. So as all of you know, this one here is exclusive, which is the upper limit. And then print xi. So what do you think? What's happening here? What will be the output? Will we have 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 0, 1, 20, and 30? The answer is no. You will have the sublists. So we have a nested list, and we have x square brackets I, one pair of square brackets. So it means we are referring to sublists, not elements. So the output is 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 0, 1, and 20, 30. So the first iteration, I is 0, the second one, I is 1, and the last iteration, I becomes 2. So x square bracket 0 refers to the first sublist, x square brackets 1 refers to the second sublist, and x square brackets 2 refers to the third sublist. So you might say, what about elements? So you don't want to print sublists, you want to print elements in each sublist. So in that case, you have to use nested for loop. So what is nested for loop? A loop inside another loop. So we say for I in range. So in range, and then what? Should I say the name of the list? Or should I say 0 from 0 to the length of the list? None of them. So here we don't use range function. So we have a better way for I in the name of the list, which is X. So this is the outer for loop. Now we need another one, which is the inner for loop. For J in I. So be careful, we don't say X. We already have X here. And this I is the sublist. And then this J represents the element in the sublist. For J in I, and you print J. So we have the list X. Now let's see. For I in X, the first iteration I is the first sublist, which is 1, 2, 3. Now we have this one, right? I equals this list. Now we have for J in I, it means J is this element, then becomes this one, and lastly becomes 3. So this is J, this is J, and this is J. So J in I. So I'm going to write the output here. So we get 1, 2, 3. So we are done with the inner for loop. We go back to the outer for loop. So the second iteration, I becomes 5, 10, 0, 1. 5, 10, 0, 1. Now we have I, which is this list. Now for j in I, j is 5, then j becomes 10, j becomes 0, and lastly j becomes 1. Now let's print 5, 10, 0, 1. 5, 10, 0, 1. And the last iteration, I becomes 20 and 30. So we have this sublist. For j in I, j is 20, and j becomes 30. So 20, 30. So this is one way to iterate through a nested list. We have some other ways, but this one is the easiest one. So let me show you another way to iterate through a nested list. For I in X, so this is the same as the previous example. So nothing has changed. So this time let's use range function. For j in range, so from the beginning to where? Len of x or something else? No, we don't say len of x. We need length of I. Because I becomes the first sublist, I becomes the second sublist, the third sublist, and so on. So len of I. And then print. So you say I, which is the sublist, and j. So this is one way. So here, let's write I is the sublist, X is the main list, which is the nested list, and j refers to the indexes. So here we have again the sublist, and we have the index of the corresponding element in this sublist. Now we have another way to iterate through a nested list. So what if you want to fill a nested list with user inputs, which is necessary sometimes, because we can't initialize a nested list all the time. So sometimes we have to ask the user to fill a nested list. So first we have an empty list, and then here we have R, number of rows or number of sublists, input, C, number of elements in each sublist, or we can say number of columns, and input. So we take values from the user for R and C. We have two values. Now we have to set up a nested for loop to fill the nested list, which is this one here. So right now this is just a list, a normal list, one-dimensional list. but later on it will be a nested list. So for I in range, so we want to construct rows or sublists for I in range R. So let's assume that we have 4 as the value of R and 2 as the value of C. So if it is 4, it means we will have 4 sublists, right? So we have to append 4 sublists to this one, to X. So how to append? We use append method, x.append. We don't want to append a number, we want to append an empty list, which is a sublist. A pair of square brackets represents an empty list. So x.append and then square brackets. Now we have the first row, the first sublist. Now let's fill the first sublist. So it says C is 2, it means we will have 2 elements in each sublist. For J in range, C, so here we will have 4 iterations. For the outer for loop, for the inner for loop, we will have 2 iterations. Now what about the elements? For each sublist, you can have another variable, let's say ELE, short for element, equals, we can have integer or float numbers. Let's use float. And then input. So I want to add ELE to the first sublist. So here we have the first sublist, right? So what is the index of the first sublist? The index is 0. So we say xi dot append ELE. So we are done. Now let's analyze the code. Let's see what's happening here. So we have X, and here R equals 4, C equals 2. For I in range 4, X.append an empty list. So let's add an empty list to X. For J in range C, which is 2. Now we have ELE equals float input 2.5. So ELE equals 2.5. Now xi dot append ELE. What is the value of I? The value of I is 0. I is 0. So R is 4, it means 0, 1, 2, 3. So x0, the first sublist. Yes, we do have an empty list here because of this statement here, x.append empty list. So we have this sublist and we want to add 2.5 to it, x0.append ELE, which is 2.5. Now we go back to the inner for loop, J becomes 1, ELE, let's say 15.2, And using this part, we can add 15.2 to the first sublist. Now we are done with the inner for loop. Now let's go back to the outer for loop. I becomes 1. So again, we append another empty list. Now we have another empty list, right? So for j in range 2, ELE, let's say 3.14. Now we have 3.14. So xi, what is the value of I? 1. So it's referring to the second sublist, which has index 1. Dot append ELE. Now let's append 3.14 to this one. So we go back to the inner for loop. J becomes 1. Let's have a value for ELE, let's say 10. X 1 dot append 10. So we add 10 to the second sublist, and we go back to the outer for loop. So we continue like this. And we stop when we have 4 sublists. Now let's say we have 5, here we have 3.14, we have -5, and here we have 6.92. So in the end, you will get something like this. List X, which is nested with 4 sublists, and each sublist has 2 elements. So this is the way to take some inputs from the user and add it, or let's say to construct a nested list. So let's finish the lesson here. I know it was long, but I had to explain everything about nested list. So as usual, take care and bye-bye.